Good evening, Tom. How are you?
Very well. Lunchtime here, Simon. Lunchtime on Sunday, a nice early spring day in the east of Scotland. How are you and where are you?
I'm fine. It's 9 p.m. here in Langkawi in Malaysia. It's about 30 degrees, just nice. Just getting used to this temperature now, Tom. Tom, I went to the gym. This will surprise you. And I don't think you'll believe this, and probably no one that knows me will believe me either. But I went to the gym this afternoon here on the holiday camp that we're in.
Right.
I was in the gym, did a wee bit of cycling and a wee bit of this, and I worked up a sweat, believe it or not.
Well, congratulations, Simon, on breaking a sweat. Something I doubt you ever did during your long service with Strathclyde Police. I suspect that. So, well,
I've sweated more talking to you on here than I ever did in my career.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Especially those quiz questions.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. I've got my quiz book here, but to be honest, your performance has been so lamentable that I've given you a break.
Tom, talking about books, I do need to mention we learned this week that April should see the release of your latest book. And when I saw it, I misread it initially, and all I saw was bombing of Edinburgh. And I thought, that's a great idea. Let me have a look at this. But it turns out you've got a new book coming out in April. Do you want to tell us a bit about it?
No, it's not a guidebook for people in the west of Scotland. I'm interested in the history of policing and justice and crime. We came across a unique collection of photographs and reports from 1944, which set out all the bombing raids in Edinburgh. There were 15 bombing raids in Edinburgh during the war. Leith docks, the Forth bridges, bombs dropped all over the place. And it's a great story. For the 80th anniversary of the end of the war this year, I produced a book, and we're having a series of lectures on the bombing of Edinburgh and Leith. So, yeah, it'll be interesting.
Tom, what's the book called?
It's called The Bombing of Edinburgh and Leith, 1939 to 1942. We've got some great pictures, fantastic standard crime scene quality pictures. I think it'll be very interesting for people who are interested in local history. So,
is that Lothian crime scene quality or Strathclyde crime scene quality?
The top Lothian crime, Edinburgh, to be more correct, Edinburgh City Police crime scene quality, who you will remember. And we're right in the forefront of crime scene photography involved in the Ruxton case. I know you like me to mention the Ruxton case. Now, don't get me wrong, Glasgow played their part, but the crime scene photography was all done by Edinburgh. First class.
So we're looking at April and a launch date, maybe something formal. The proceeds of the book are going to charity, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. We've got a charity which is dedicated to preserving, interpreting legal documents and the history of policing. And so all the proceeds, all the profits are going to that charity. That's right.
Sounds like I might need to actually buy that one.
Listen, you should, and because I know you'll be strapped for cash when you get home.
Double.
I'll give you a discount.
Tom, our deep dive team have been busy this week, and again we've got quite a variety of cases from far and wide and also from close at home for me. The first case they covered was interesting. I remember these days in Strathclyde, this was a kind of DOS for us, casinos late at night that were open in those days till 4 and 5 in the morning, and they were always good for a coffee and for keeping tabs on some of the main index criminals floating about the town late at night and who they were associating with. This was an inside man in a casino in France where they had rigged the roulette. An interesting case, wasn't it?
Fascinating, particularly because it was 1973, and I'd never heard of it. But the thought of putting a little radio device inside a roulette ball was absolutely ingenious, and it was way ahead of its time. And of course, all these things beg the question: if that's what somebody could do in 1973, what's somebody doing now?
Yeah,
I thought it was fascinating. Again, at the end of the story, there's a femme fatale, and somebody falls for the girl. And how many tales of disaster have been brought about by that, Simon? No, I'm not asking you to make personal comment on it.
It just showed that what we talk about regularly with crime and criminals is that sometimes they have good schemes and clever planning, but greed gets to them, doesn't it? They just push the boat out that bit too far, and that's what generally gets them caught. Because it looks as though they made a lot of money doing this, and if they had kept it at a reasonable level, I don't think anyone would have noticed for much longer. But the greed gets there, doesn't it, Tom? They can't stop.
That's right. And what they could have done is moved on to
Yeah,
another casino. And that's what some of these fraudsters do down in Las Vegas. They move around the casinos, and they've got an intelligence system which actually plots these people who
yeah,
are winning disproportionately. But I thought it was great that she had her little device in a cigarette packet with a
yeah,
dummy, and how it all blew up was somebody, can I have a cigarette? Of course, there's no cigarettes in the packet.
yeah,
Again, just
yeah, yeah,
a small, but for all the sophistication in it, this was very sophisticated.
yes,
They're let down by a small detail. They could surely have had one row of cigarettes in the packet for just in case.
of
And
course.
the fact that she was walking about with this cigarette pack
Uh-huh.
ostentatiously and never smoked, I mean,
Yes,
that's another
yeah.
dead giveaway.
The,
Very interesting, though. Very
one of
interesting
the
case.
things the casinos do, and I don't know how recent this is, I don't think it is recent at all, because I've not been in a casino for years, but they used to change croupier every 10, 15, 20 minutes, something like that. I don't know what the pattern was, but for that reason. But I read a thing about, in fact, I heard a story about in the storms in Florida, there was a couple of towns that were levelled by the hurricanes and whatnot, and one of the casinos was levelled, and they found magnets underneath where the roulette tables would have been. There were a series of magnets underneath, and I don't think they quite figured out the scam or what exactly was going on, but obviously they were giving the house an edge.
Like you, we used the casinos as watering holes because the food was excellent. The buffets were usually free, subsidised by the
Yes.
gamblers.
Yeah.
But the last thing you did was actually gamble.
That's
And
right.
this guy told me, he said, look, he said, when you're playing against a person, you've got a chance, but you've got no chance against a machine. The slot machines will always beat you. Stay away from them. If you're playing against a croupier or you're playing against somebody, there's a chance they will make a mistake. It's not a big chance, but there's a chance they'll make a mistake, but not a machine. A machine will never make a mistake. He also said, when you go into a casino, look at the thick carpets, look at the opulence,
Yeah.
and ask yourself, who paid for this?
Right at the end of the podcast, I think there was a bit cheeky from our deep dive team. I think there's something going on here that we're not party to, Tom. Did you hear the very end when the deep dive guy says, "Oh, and I know two guys who got very lucky when they met the producer of this show." Did you hear that?
Yeah, I noticed that. They are getting a little bit cheeky, and it's time we took them down a peg or two. They've been really good. I admire their research; it's tremendous.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's like everything else. You've just got to watch, and then you've just got to rap them on the nose now and again.
It's back to March 1971. I couldn't help but think about you and your FBI background. I know you don't like to talk about working with the FBI years ago. I was thinking about your other mantra on here that you're always reminding me of, that thing called evidence. Here we have people breaking into an FBI office, and what do they find? They found evidence showing that the FBI had been up to dirty tricks. What did you make of all this?
Well, I knew about
Right.
this case, and it was interesting because it was very well planned, not by criminals, interestingly, very well planned. They chose the night of the Ali-Fraser fight, which, of course, everybody was watching the Ali-Fraser fight. Yeah, it was very interesting. And, of course, it was 40 years before it was exposed. This whole story is a direct legacy of J. Edgar Hoover, the
Yes.
great J. Edgar Hoover, who ruled and ran the FBI with a rod of iron for 45 years. And in fact, he only died in 1972. This is J. Edgar Hoover paranoid, collecting information about everybody, anybody. It's almost like the Stasi in East Germany. If you were left wing, if you were liberal, if you were gay, if you had any sort of affiliation at all, they would collect information about you. There was still a legacy of that. Some of the senior FBI people that I met in the 80s had been appointed by J. Edgar Hoover.
Right.
And he left a legacy on the Bureau for about 20 years. The whole cohort of people that he'd appointed were gone. And then there was a breath of fresh air blew through the place. And don't get me wrong, they were good. They were very good. And they had great systems and great equipment. They were high quality agents. But there was this underlying thing from the J. Edgar Hoover days of everybody was a suspect. And if you didn't look like them and didn't have a white shirt, blue tie, and a smart cut suit, then and this came to light during the Vietnam War, demonstrations, and of course the legacy of the McCarthy witch hunts in the 50s and 60s. And I when I read this, I could just see the ghost of J. Edgar Hoover here. That's exactly how you run an office. And I've got to say, you've got a field office in Pennsylvania holding confidential information with obviously inadequate security systems. You've got to say, oh dear, 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 that was not a very good idea at all.
It's often what happens when power goes too far, isn't it? That it gets a bit blasé as well.
Just did too much. You see, and J. Edgar Hoover, he saw himself as being the moral guardian of the United States and indeed the Western world.
Yeah.
And the reason he stayed in post so long was because he knew where all the bodies were buried. The first thing he did when a new president arrived, from Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, all the way through, was go and see them and lay out all that he knew. In other words, saying, leave me alone because I know where the bodies were buried. And of course, career politicians, there's always something.
Yes.
There's always something which could be interpreted. And so I think they saw him as a dangerous individual who they would rather keep close rather than make an enemy of. And that's why he survived as long as he did.
Hence his 45-year career.
Yeah.
Tom, it's interesting that when I was reading it or listening to it, what became obvious was that those checks and balances we talk about, whether it be the law itself, whether it be regulation, they come about because of incidents, whether it be a shooting, an assassination that we spoke about last week, whether it be something like this, when it becomes obvious that there's been they've overstepped the mark with surveillance and whatnot. It generally takes an instant like that for the regulation to come into force that brings the pendulum back to that medium again, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It does. There's a reaction, and then they put in a lot of checks and balances, and then over the years that slides away. But I've got to say, in terms of untrammeled power, what's going on just now with Trump throwing his weight about as a one-man band, I thought that the American system was much more controlled by the Senate and the Congress.
Yep.
But it appears that President Trump is just behaving as if he was a dictator. It's what he
covered these executive orders during his last tenure. But there's got to be accountability, Tom. He still has to answer to the Senate and Congress. What he's doing just now is a lot of posturing. It doesn't mean that a lot of that is going to get through. He's still got to go and argue the case, although he's got a majority in both houses just now.
He's all powerful, and the Democrats made such a hash of the election. Joe Biden stayed too long, and it was quite clear he wasn't fit for office. He was too old. He has untrammeled power. But what he's doing just now, particularly in relation to Ukraine, could have worldwide consequences for generations to come, Simon. It might affect our grandchildren in terms of what he's doing. I just hope, a lot of what he's doing, I can see the sense of it. But I just hope that there's an element of measure there. I really do, because he's concerned.
He's shaking things up, which isn't a bad thing. There has to be checks and balances. And somebody has to be behind him saying, just be careful what you're doing here. Because he gives the impression that he's making it up as he goes along, doesn't he?
I think he is. But anyway, the proof of the pudding, it'll all come out.
Tom, we're going to have a wee advert break. Before we do that, can I just ask you, did you have to get dragged out by the heels out your office, screaming and shouting, or did you know when the time was right?
No, I knew when the time was right.
Right.
And I was always cognizant of that. I knew when my service, I had a plan and I stuck to it. And I was actually offered an extension to take on another piece of work, because I'd just done the World's End murders, which I was really pleased I was involved in towards the end, because I'd been so involved in it throughout my service. So I was delighted to do that.
It went full circle there, didn't it? That was a nice full stop.
That was the time. That was definitely the time to go. I just knew it. And plus, I'd been asked to go and do other jobs. So I was looking forward to something fresh, and I don't regret any of it, and I don't regret my timing. People often ask me, oh, do you wish you were still? And I said, no, I don't.
No.
Not at all.
Somebody asked me today, do you miss the police? I was honest with them and said that I miss my colleagues. For
Yeah.
the first year, I missed the banter. And luckily, I was still going to court for about a year after I left.
Yeah.
So I was still getting to meet the boys. But that only made it worse that you would miss the banter and the shifts and the guys, but not the job, because the job's moved on, Tommy. It's not the job you and I were in.
No, that's right. Somebody once said to me that the minute you leave the job, you veer off slightly left, and the job veers off slightly right, and you find yourself after 6 months a huge gap in between. I think that's right. The one thing I missed terribly was not being in the know. 'Cause, I mean, I was in a situation where anything happened at all, I got the first phone call. There was a couple of things happened after I left, and I was tempted to phone up somebody and said, "Have you thought about this?" And I didn't, Simon. I didn't do it.
It's funny, Tom, because for the first time I'm thinking about that. There was a saying at our level in the CID and whatever, when something kicked off, what am I going to do? You're going to phone someone. And that's not the word that was used, but you know what I mean. You're going to phone someone. So you were always phoning the next up the line, weren't you? You were always, I'll phone the DI, I'll phone the DCI, I'll phone the super. You were very nearly the last person to get the call.
I'll never forget when I was promoted in the squad, there'd been a death. We were called to the mortuary. And we were standing, there was a DS, 2 DSs, 2 or 3 DCs, and we're standing around looking at the body of this guy lying in his lap. And one of them turned to me and said, "What do we do now, boss?" That was a penny drop moment for me, because there was nobody that I could turn to and say, "What do we do now, boss?" It was a lonely moment in the mortuary.
I had an old sergeant, John McLennan, he's long gone now, and you would go to him as a probationer and say, "Sergeant, I've got a farmer in wanting to dip his sheep or something. I don't know what he's talking about." He'd say, "Right, son, grab the big book there, volume 2, I think you'll find." And he'd make you look up the 4th standing order to learn what to do. And I remember thinking, he's very clever. But it turned out he'd no idea about virtually anything. That's all he did was make you look it up and then tell him.
Maybe inadvertently, it wasn't a bad way to do it, because you learned yourself.
That's true. So we'll have a wee ad break there, Tom. The third case this week was close to home for me. I could go on about this all night because it's so close to home and I had so many dealings, not just with the Thompson family. The subject here was Arthur Thompson Sr. We'll try and stick to Sr. because there's so many avenues we could go down, especially Ferris, because I did have quite a few dealings with Ferris over the years. But no doubt we'll talk about him in the future. I hear he's got a new film coming out. Did you hear that?
No, and to be honest with you, you'd have to force me to watch anything from these people. I've got some questions for you on this, but you carry on at the moment. You carry on.
I might answer them and I might not. We'll see how it goes. But just Arthur Thompson Sr. The first thing that struck me was this. They always called him the Godfather. The press have got so much to answer for, Tom, over the years, haven't they? Because he was nothing like what I would consider a godfather to be. A godfather to me, and it obviously comes from the mafia, looked after his people and had the respect of his community and had an interest in the welfare of his community. Okay, there was a price to pay. When he wanted them to do something, they jumped and did it. And everything was the rule of force, of course. I'm not making the mafia out to be anything virtuous here. But what I'm saying is that Thompson was no way involved in his community or any of that stuff. He was a scumbag. He really was.
I watched him afar. Obviously, they didn't come through to the east. Thompson, Walter Norval, Paul Ferris, all that clique of people. But I often wondered, Simon, how they got away with it and were allowed to operate for so long. And I tell you what, it struck me, a very close parallel with the Cray twins in London, who they were associated with.
Yeah, of course.
Or Thompson was, anyway. But with the Cray twins, how it was all brought to head, of course. They brought in a completely independent inquiry team under Nipper Reid, the famous detective.
Yep.
And I wondered, what do you think? I think they were given too much credit and they were given too much leeway. And you're right, the press glorified them. And this gangster noir, where they were celebrated, almost lionized, I found awful. And in fact, that's why I won't want any of these gangsters films and famous
I don't watch
killers
them
and all
either.
that sort of stuff. It's
Let me answer your question then. I'm going to be totally candid with you, but it's my opinion. Formed watching what was going on. Remember, I was a DC at the time, so I didn't have any input here. I was just a soldier, but I could see exactly what was going on round about us, and it happened in every division. It happened throughout Strathclyde, and I now know, or I learned afterwards, that it's a phenomenon up and down the country, and CID offices up and down the country. That, yes, the press things get something to do with it, but that was fed by the police as well. The truth of the matter is that Arthur Thompson lasted so long because he was an informant, because he was playing the police as much as he was playing anyone else.
Yeah.
And he got rid of his opposition that way. There was 2 or 3 senior detectives, not too senior, but inspector rank thereabouts, who were experts, who anything that had to do with the Thompsons went through them because they were close to the source and all that. And it was an absolute nonsense that if you wanted to go and interview someone connected with them, you very often got it taken off you and it got taken away for one of these experts to deal with. And the relationships between the Thompsons and other criminals in Glasgow and beyond, and the senior detectives that's supposed to be policing them, were unhealthy for everyone involved. What it needed was an outsider, was to say to Edinburgh, send a team through here and have a look at the murders here of Hanlon and Glover or whatever. And it'd have been a totally different outcome, I'm quite sure, because they'd have been dealt with impartially and properly, instead of being dealt with all the politics that goes on between relationships between police officers and between criminals and police officers.
I'm not surprised, and thank you for your candour. That's certainly the impression I got. I thought they were treated with too much respect. And this business about being informants, they're serving up their rivals and they're serving up minor players to protect their own major operations. So it's very difficult. And of course, today, that wouldn't happen, because today you would have the National Crime Agency set on them.
Yes.
And in fact, that's what's happened recently with some of the big organised crime groups through in the West. It's been an NCA led, so it's been detectives from the Midlands and these sort of places dispassionate and do not have that respect. I think I told you before that I remember there was a housebreaker, a very, very good housebreaker in Edinburgh. And it was funny because when you were going through the house break-ins, they would say, oh, that'll be so-and-so. He's called the Spade Man because he always used a garden spade to break it. It was very, very good. Oh, that'll be him. And that'll be so-and-so. And the subtext of that was, that'll be him, and therefore there's no point in investigating him because we'll never catch him. And it was just written off.
Yeah.
And of course, 9 times out of 10, it wasn't him at all. And it was giving him far too much respect. And that's what happened to the Cray twins. That's what happened to the Richardson gang in the Met.
Yeah,
until you got an independent team in. And I felt over the years, I wondered whether that was the story with Arthur Thompson. And I'm interested in your observations from it, because you saw it. I was only viewing it from 40 miles away. You saw it up close. But
I saw it happen. I saw it going on, and I knew that Thompson was using the police much more than we were getting from him.
Yeah.
Do you remember the story I did for Small Town Decks? And they called it the penny drops.
Yeah.
And okay, it wasn't on the scale of Thompson, but all the criminals are the same to me anyway. There's no scale. They're just Neds, and that's the end of it. So in that case, it was a would-be Hartman and Rossi. But everybody had made their mind up that he had been guilty for years and years of these indecencies all over the island. And it was that blinkers on, same idea that, we know what's going on here, we've got a handle on it, but we've not got the evidence. But a lot of nonsense. And it needed somebody new coming in, me, a bit naive and unwilling to accept that narrative, to have a look at it. The press, of course, play their part because they regurgitate everything that they get without any inside knowledge of it at all, so they can be played very easily.
And by the way, some of these gangsters, they play the press as well.
Yeah,
I mean, Arthur Thompson would be speaking to reporters and whatnot. So it's both ends against the middle.
Yeah.
And
when it comes right down, I think the main thing that I wanted to get across about this whole episode in Glasgow's history and crime history, because this wasn't the only family. And I could name a dozen other families that have caused similar heartache in the communities across Glasgow and Strathclyde. The thing that I really wanted to get across about it was that, and I don't have any, I can't go back to the 50s when he was bombing people and he was a real rascal, but really it was about how mad you could be. Ferris was mad. He was ruthless. Ruthless doesn't do it justice. He was irrational. The risks that he took were incredible, but he would walk into a pub and shoot somebody in the knee and walk out again. He was absolutely off the scale. And Thompson was the same with the violence that they used. So there was nothing romantic about this. There was nothing godfatherish about it or nice music playing in the background. These guys were an absolute nightmare in the communities that they were peddling drugs, they were money lending, they were into all sorts of crime. Anything that was going, they wanted a hand in it. And it was absolutely ruthless for the people that they came across.
And of course, that was right, because I mean, Ferris and these people, there were, but that sort of psychotic behaviour, which is what you're describing, was part of their reputation. That's what made them feared.
Yes.
Was the fact that they would do anything, that there was no logic to what they would do, that they would howk your eye out. And that was actually a deliberate tactic to make them feared, because actually they weren't all that big physically, or
No,
you know,
not at all.
and plenty of people could have taken them on, but it was that mad, that psychotic
the
element
madness
to them.
Yeah, totally irrational, unpredictable. A bit like, and a wee bit like across the water with the kneecapping and whatnot, the punishment, shootings and whatnot. It was all about force. So I just wanted to get that across for our listeners.
No, that's right. I'll tell you what it reminded me of. It reminded me of, and coming back, unashamedly, coming back to the Ruxton story, was the way that Percy Sillitoe dealt with that same pattern of behaviour, because back in the 30s, these big gangs roamed about parts of Glasgow, the Billy Boys and these gangs. And he paid them no respect whatsoever. He just set about breaking them up and met violence with violence, basically.
Yes.
Turned his mounted branch into a light cavalry, and you know.
And that might be something that our listeners that weren't police officers, that they might find not very palatable. But it's the way it was. You had to fight fire with fire. And the only things these guys understood was brute force, basically, Tom. I was thinking about it today when I was thinking about Thompson. Some of the raids we went on and whatnot, you had no idea if there was going to be firearms involved. You had no idea what was behind some of these doors, what kind of drugs they might be on, what kind of state of mind they might be in. So our tactics, as you know, were absolutely ruthless. Obviously, the force we used was, what's the word?
Proportionate. Proportionate.
Proportionate force was used at all times. I'm laughing as I say that. But we were making sure that we were safe and nobody was going to get hurt doing the job. But somebody had to go and arrest these guys and get them in and question them and whatnot. And that's what's going on all over the country, keeping a lid on some of these nutcases that if they were left to run wild, there's no saying what they would be doing.
And the irony is, Simon, that he probably knew you were coming.
Yeah, that's true. He certainly knew when we'd been.
Actually, all the doors are off the hinges.
Tom, we'll leave Arthur there because I've no doubt his name will come up in future dispatches as well, as will some of his cohorts. We don't need to go over the story because the deep dive team did a great job of giving us the pertinent facts of the Thompson life of crime as we know it.
They did a very good job, dispassionate job. I hope we don't talk about him again, because you know what? I don't want to pay him any more respect.
No, you're absolutely right.
I'll talk all day about clever criminals.
Yes.
About people who pull strokes, the folk who fixed the roulette wheel, the people that broke into the FBI office. These are interesting cases. Yeah. Thugs,
Gentle Johnny,
thugs.
Gentle Johnny.
Aye, Romensky, Huey Mannion. These are people who are interesting and we should talk about. We shouldn't give any further airtime to gangsters and violent people.
Good, I agree wholeheartedly. Case 4 we're moving on to was July 1954. Couldn't be much further away from my old beat in Glasgow. Bay Village murder. Tom, what do you make of this when the face is mutilated, if that's the right word, but so many injuries to the face and head? Everything tells us that's rage. It's personal, doesn't it?
It's close to home, yeah. The disfigurement of a face like that would tend, and also it tends to suggest a young perpetrator. It's a bit like the sexual assault rule that the older the victim, if you get an old lady who's been sexually assaulted, you're looking for a young man who's done it. And I think you're looking very close to home. And I think this case, put it this way, Simon, if this happened today, it would be solved. I'm convinced of it.
Yes.
It would be solved. Because I don't think it is a mystery. I think this guy, Richard Everling, was a very good suspect. And I think, but again, this happened in the sticks. Goodness knows what sort of crime scene management there was, if any. Goodness knows how it was investigated for the first crucial 48, 72 hours. Who knows? It might have been investigated by some old sheriff who had never come across anything like this before in his life. So, it got off to a terrible start. But I, at the end of the day, when I was listening to the deep dive team, who did a good job on this again, I did not find it much of a mystery, to be frank. I think it was Everling. And there was a mention that there may be new evidence yet. And of course, we know that if the forensic productions have been kept in a proper manner, then the potential it is. But I'd put a small bet on Richard Everling being the man. He knew them, he was close to them, he had all the hallmarks.
And he should have been looked at in the first instance, of course.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know how we were talking last week about the brain manipulation, the brainwashing, etc. In our podcast last week we covered, and we referred it to films, The Manchurian Project and Damien, what's his name? Matt Damon. We spoke about the films that it could be based on. This was the same, I thought, with Harrison Ford and The Fugitive.
Yes, yeah.
Do you remember it? With Tommy Lee Jones tracking him down.
Aye, yeah, I do.
Yeah, and there had been an intruder, and he had a struggle with him, and he was knocked out, and when he woke up, his wife was dying on the floor. It was very similar to that.
Yeah, very much.
Without, all they needed was Tommy Lee Jones, and they might have solved it if he'd been there, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, on that one, Tom, on the murder, the Bay Village murder, with Dr. Shepherd doing 10 years, and tragically he only lived 4 years after he was out. A real miscarriage of justice as well.
Yeah.
Fair enough, the police not having the resources or the knowledge or the equipment maybe to protect the scene and gather the evidence that we know they should have. But the press jumped on this, didn't they, and decided it was the doctor himself, the husband himself. And that seems to have... Because there didn't seem to be a lot of evidence at the trial either.
No,
It was all...
but Shepherd was convicted for what he was rather than what he did. His reputation was blackened before the trial. And so the juries all knew his background, etc., etc. And so his reputation was seriously harmed before the trial. And therefore, that sort of was led to compensate for lack of evidence. But yeah, I think it was a miscarriage of justice.
There was always also the allegation, if you like, or the hint that the judge had made his mind up before the trial as well.
Well, the judge had made temperate comments, etc. That's right. I know it wasn't a shining example of justice, in my view. No, it wasn't.
Tom, we'll have another wee advert break then, and then we've got our last two cases, very interesting cases this week.
Very much.
The first one is 1980, the Iranian embassy, and we've spoke about it on here before because, of course, we spoke about Yvonne Fletcher and her murder in London, and this was the big one as far as our Special Air Service were concerned, because it was the first time that I remember them being on public like that, because they've always been shadows that we hear about, but we never know what they're doing. But this was televised. This was a live performance, if you like, wasn't it? Did you watch it?
Yeah, I did. I was fascinated by it. It's a very interesting case, this. It's an important case. And I have a wee bit inside knowledge of this case because much later I met Clive Fairweather. He was the major in the SAS, and he actually did all the organisation for the siege. It was a guy called Mike Rose, who was the commander of the SAS. He rose to be a 4-star general. But Clive Fairweather did it, and I spoke to Clive about it. I met Clive because he was the colonel up at the barracks at Glencorse in the Glencorse shooting, which was in 1985. And I met Clive then, and he was looking after the barracks at Glencorse. But so I knew a little bit about the Iranian embassy, and there was a couple of things he told me which are really interesting. One was their plan assumed 50% casualties.
Right.
So when they put the plan, and they put the plan to the defence secretary, and they put the plan to Margaret Thatcher herself, and they said, look, if we go in and do this, you've got to expect and assume 50% casualties.
Okay.
And they went, okay, just go and do it.
Yeah.
And he said that whatever you said about the politicians, they had balls.
Yes.
They were
yes.
prepared to go for it. Because there was a very important subtext to this whole thing. And
That's
Margaret
true.
Thatcher said to them, look, it's very important that the message goes out to the world that if you pull off this kind of stunt, you're not leaving.
Yes.
You're not leaving. You're not going to succeed. You've got to know that. Everybody's got to know that you're not
Yep.
walking out. And of course, ironically, in 1984, Yvonne Fletcher, that's
Yeah.
exactly what they did. They walked out,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
I could never understand, because Clive said to me that, but he also said that there was an unwelcome side to it too, because all of a sudden the SAS became the 22nd Regiment of the SAS. That's the crowd that
Yeah.
do that.
Operational.
They became celebrities,
Yes.
and it led to all sorts of trouble, because they had been operating under the radar for years. They had been
Yeah.
fighting in these little wars in Dhofar and these places, these secret wars. They'd been
Yep.
engaged in Ireland, obviously,
Yeah.
but always been under the radar. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they're thrust into the limelight, and not just that, they're on television, for goodness sake. You know. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting. His perspective on it was very interesting. But in terms of the PR, and in terms of how it presented itself, it was a brilliant episode. And
Yes.
it made the reputation of the SAS to such an extent that the SAS were called by other special forces all over the world, and other
Oh, yeah.
special forces actually modelled themselves on the SAS.
Totally.
So-
In Australia, I was
Yeah.
talking to someone about it just a couple of weeks ago. They're almost identical in everything.
Well,
But-
they're
they-
interchangeable. The Australian SAS come
Yes.
across and work, and there's an interchange there. Yeah.
And a lot of countries are like that. And we were
Yeah.
a bit like that, Tom, as well, in the National Surveillance Unit. It was the SAS training that we used. We used their
Right.
codes, we used their systems, their radio systems, and it was their template, surveillance template, that was passed down, and a lot of their operational stuff that was passed down. And that'll be the same in police forces all across the world. When push comes to shove, I was talking to you about just a minute ago about force, about using reasonable force when you enter premises or whatever. We stole a lot of stuff about the confusion, the chaos and confusion that you cause when you go in somewhere. I remember raiding a pub, an upstairs of a pub in Glasgow, because there was two MI criminals, major index criminals in it that we wanted very badly. But there was a lot of drugs and a few firearms involved too. And what we did was take the support unit's big lights, you know, the big 2,000 candle lights that they
Yeah.
had that they put in the helicopter and things like that.
Yeah.
And when we ran in, that light was shining. Two lights were shining, and there's nobody could see anything in there for maybe 10, 15 seconds. That's all it takes, as you know. So all of these chaos and confusion was the name of the day when you were getting into a violent situation like that. And that was all came from the SAS and their expertise, because they really were something else. Did I ever tell you about the hangar that I went into when they were, when it was an exercise? And there was supposed to be hostages being held in
Yeah.
an aeroplane on the runway and all that. I'll tell you about it someday. We're running a wee bit short this week for time, but I'll tell you about it another time. And it's very interesting, the dealings we had with the SAS that day.
Yeah, I've had a few dealings with them operationally and on exercises, and I've always found them. They're an interesting bunch of people, and of course
Yeah.
they're so disarming, because you expect to see huge, big, muscular men, but they're not.
That's right. Yeah. And we were talking about criminals who were a bit off the scale, shall we say. There was none of them as off the scale as some of the SAS guys that I came across over the years.
Well, I mean that there's an interesting story to be told there about the Peterhead riots, which, of course, coming back to the Glencorse Corporal Andrew Walker, the man who shot dead and murdered his comrades in arms. He was in Peterhead prison, and of course that was broken up by the SAS. And these were extremely violent men who were protesting in Peterhead prison, but they did not come close when they came to.
They thought they were violent. They thought
that's right. They thought they were good. But I mean, that changed the way that everything was done too, because of course I think wrongly the Crown wanted the SAS soldiers to be witnesses in the case, and the SAS afterwards said, we're not going to help again, we're not going to do that again. And that was a shame, because they undoubtedly, not just in an operational sense, but in an advisory sense, they were absolutely superb. They really were. Yeah.
I'm glad I was on their side. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah, me too.
Tom, our last case, and I know you've got a real personal interest in this one as well, because it was part of the operation that you were asked to lead into the World's End murders. I'll let you explain that in a minute, but this is the Templeton Woods in Dundee, the 2 girls that were found murdered in the woods. Tell us how that related to the World's End murder inquiry.
Yeah, okay. The murder of 2 young women, Carol Lannan in 1979 and Elizabeth McCabe a year later in February 1980. Both bodies of young women, both strangled, both deposited in the Templeton Woods area of Dundee. And Templeton Woods was a sort of a well-known courting spot and place where sex workers sometimes took clients.
Okay.
And Carol Lannan was a sex worker, and Elizabeth McCabe was not. And so there's differences there. There was also differences in the way they had been killed. They'd both been strangled, but one had been strangled with their clothes and the other had been manually strangled. And when we started Operation Trinity to look at the work of Angus Sinclair and the crimes of Angus Sinclair, we first of all took these 2 crimes into our ambit. We started to look at them. But we very quickly discovered that Angus Sinclair could not have been responsible for these crimes, because he was actually in prison when they were committed.
Okay.
So he was in the clear for that. But we did take a long, hard look. I took a long, hard look at them during that period when we were interested in them. And they're interesting cases. And I always took the view that they were quite separate, that the deposition of Elizabeth McCabe in Templeton Wood was actually a deliberate decoy. It was a copycat, because I don't think they've got anything to do with each other. Carol Lannan was a sex worker, and her case is actually very close to Sheila Anderson's case. Now, we've the sex worker who was killed on the promenade. And in fact, when Sheila Anderson was murdered, we actually got in touch with Dundee and did quite a lot of work looking at that case. At the end of the day, there was nothing they could tell us, because they were looking for a culprit too. But these cases were very similar. Sex worker, taken at a secluded spot, murdered, and personal belongings found some distance away.
Yes.
So very, very similar. Now, Elizabeth McCabe, totally different. Out city centre, gets in a taxi to go home, and is then found dead, strangled. And the taxi driver was really a very strong suspect. And in fact, initially,
he went to court, didn't he?
He was charged. There was DNA evidence, but it wasn't a full profile, and they put it to court, and unfortunately he walked away. I think he was very lucky to walk away. And if I was a betting man, I would have said that he had something to answer for.
This is Vincent Simpson. Vincent Simpson.
The other guy, Andrew Hunter, who had mentioned as suspect, that's just a fiction of amateur detectives and the tabloid press. There's nothing to suspect at all. Yeah.
Did the Dundee detectives link the 2 cases? Because we've spoke about the danger of linking cases prematurely before. Were these Templeton Woods murders linked? It seemed that the deep dive team talked about them as if they were linked, as if it was obviously the same killer. And the press again played their part by inventing this disco killer because the girls had been out on the town in Dundee. Did the Dundee police put on blinkers like that?
No, they didn't. No, they didn't. And again, I think the Dundee police learned from Bible John.
Yes.
Learned from the horrors of Bible John on of linking cases which could not be linked.
Yeah.
And so they always kept an open mind, because when I went up there to have a look at it, to bring it into Operation Trinity, I actually spoke to some of the people who'd been on the original investigation, who had retired, and they came in and were very helpful. And they made it clear that no, they were never convinced that the two were linked. They thought that the deposition of Elizabeth McCabe was a copycat.
And I take it we never found any association between the two girls. There was never any cross.
No,
nothing.
Nothing whatsoever. They were from completely different worlds. Suffice to say that there was never any connection with that. Now, of course, you might say Simpson was a taxi driver. He could have picked up Carol Lannan, because the forensic evidence was the McCabe case. He might have picked up Carol Lannan. Well, he might have done, but it was much more like a punter.
Right.
And the publicity was enormous. Now, in terms of the investigations, the Lannan case particularly was investigated in, shall I say, the mode of the time. And quite a lot of the witnesses, the early witnesses, were people who were using sex workers or were involved in the sex industry. And they were treated pretty roughly, some of them, frankly.
Okay.
Now, there's a problem there, really, Simon, and that is, once you've treated someone in a rough manner, it's very difficult to come back.
Yeah.
It's very difficult then to become their pal.
Yes.
If you've treated them in a rough manner. So that wasn't good in the Lannan case. But what I will say about both cases is, in both cases, they preserved what forensic evidence they had in a very professional manner for the time, and they kept it to the extent that it could still give up some information, although not the complete information, come the day in the trial, which was about 2005, 2006. So,
unlike Strathclyde Police, but that's another story.
I'm glad you said that. I wasn't going to say that, but yeah, that's right. Did a good job on that, and credit to them. Now the question is this, right? So they decided they had a sufficiency of evidence, and they went to trial in 2006, I think, or thereby, and the case fell.
Yeah.
The question really is, with the DNA evidence, had they waited a couple of years until science had crept on, perhaps there would have been more from that evidence. But that's a decision for the Crown on the balance, and it's all very well to second guess them, but they must have thought they had a decent opportunity to get it.
And that's the thing, they thought they had enough to convict him, but juries are juries, and in court things can go wrong, as we know only too well. Procedurally, we spoke about that as well. Two things, Tom. One was the deep dive team said at one point the police made significant blunders, but they never went on to tell us what those blunders were. Is that what you're referring to there, was the interrogation or the initial statement taking in the case? Is that what they're talking about?
Yeah, I guess so. I wasn't quite sure myself what they were referring to. But yeah, and they did alienate a lot of important witnesses at the time. People who were in and around the red light district, people in and around the sex industry, people who had something to tell.
Yes, and you don't want to ostracise them.
Precisely. And they might not tell you the first time you meet them, but that's no reason to give them a cuff around the ear.
As long as it's a reasonable force cuff around the ear. Tom, just to finish on this case, because it's very interesting from your perspective, and I suppose I should explain to our Crime Time listeners, just in case they've joined us recently or not too aware of all the episodes. I believe we've got nearly 200 episodes up and running now, that you can go back. And way back in season 1, episodes 18 to 23, we talk about the World's End murders. And we did that when your book on the World's End murders was coming out. So anybody that wants to save £10, £12, doesn't need to buy that book. They can listen to the episodes 18 to 23 in season 1.
No, they can't. Simon, if they want the real story, they've got to buy that book. You can get a lot cheaper on Kindle, Simon. A lot cheaper on Kindle.
What's the full title, Tom? It's The World's End Murders.
The World's End Murders, The Inside Story.
So there you are. And it really is. And the reason I mention it, Tom, is because of Angus Robertson Sinclair, who was a suspect in this case, and you led Operation Trinity that eventually snared Sinclair for the World's End murders, years later. So the full story really is on those episodes when we chat about Angus Robertson Sinclair, who we all know, and I suppose it's a matter of opinion, but I'm convinced by you that he was the most evil killer to ever walk the streets of Scotland.
Certainly the most dangerous man in terms of women in the 20th century, if you look at how long he was out of prison and his catalogue of offences. But can I just correct you on one thing? I didn't solve the World's End murders. That was done by fastidious forensic work way back in 1977.
What I said was you led the operation that eventually snared them and took them to court.
That's true. I did. That's true. I did. But the credit goes to a whole lot of people going back down the years. And come back to this whole thing about I'm not obsessed by it, but I get annoyed by this great detective thing because it's all about teams. It is all about teams.
Yeah, totally. Tom, that's been fascinating. Thanks for sharing that with us. And I'd recommend The World's End Murder to anyone, the book, because it, like Ruxton, the first modern murder, it really is a revelation to get it firsthand like that. All right, Tom, I look forward to speaking to you soon. Take
care of yourself and don't work too hard.
No, I'll be in Dubai the next time I speak to you, so I'm winging my way home gradually.
Gradually. All right, Simon. You take care of yourself.
Yep, Tom.
Bye.